The standard bridge height on any American highway is 16 feet. This standard is not designed for civilian trucks. It's designed for the passage of mobile intercontinental ballistic missile launchers. This is not a coincidence, but a deliberate military engineering code embedded in the DNA of the entire system. Over 46,876 miles of asphalt, every bridge adheres to this single military standard. Millions of people drive under these structures daily, unaware of their true, chilling Cold War purpose. Beneath the guise of the greatest civilian project in history lay an even larger military plan, and this is just the first of 5 secret codes woven into the asphalt. However, 2 paradoxes lie within this. The first, how could a system, publicly created to save millions by evacuating cities during a nuclear attack, be secretly designed to turn into a giant death trap? Early civil defense simulations showed that the average time for a complete blockage of an evacuation route from a major city was only 4 hours. We will find the answer in Section 6. And the second, financial paradox. Why was the most expensive public project in history, costing the state over $500 billion in modern prices, funded by a civilian road fund and not from the virtually bottomless military budget of the Pentagon, if its main goal was national defense? We will unravel this mystery in Section 4. By the end of this film, you will stop seeing highways as simply asphalt and concrete. You will learn to recognize their hidden functions, identify sections designed for military aircraft landings, understand why road curves have a specific radius, and see in every element of a bridge's construction an echo of nuclear deterrence strategy. You will learn to see at least 3 hidden signs: reserve runways, anti-tank thickenings, and missile corridors. The road you drive to work every day is not just a transportation artery. It is a silent monument to humanity's greatest fear and simultaneously the last line of defense in an unfulfilled World War III. Our investigation will follow this path, like a river revealing geological strata. Each layer will be deeper and more surprising than the last. In just 4 minutes, we will be transported to the ruins of Nazi Germany to see through the eyes of young General Eisenhower how the idea of using roads as weapons originated on the Autobahns of the Third Reich. In 11 minutes, we will gain access to secret Pentagon documents and decipher 5 military engineering codes that transform civilian highways into a military network. And in 20 minutes, we will find ourselves at the most tense moment of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, to see how this entire gigantic system was brought to full combat readiness, awaiting orders. How could it be that the main symbol of American freedom, the highway system, has its roots in the infrastructure project of the Third Reich? The answer begins with one man, General Dwight Eisenhower. In the summer of 1945, speeding along the smooth concrete of the Autobahn near Frankfurt, he felt not comfort, but a cold pang of envy. At first glance, he simply admired German engineering. However, the reality was much deeper. This was not admiration, but a cold analysis from a general. He saw how this system allowed the Wehrmacht to rapidly deploy divisions and wage war on 2 fronts. Eisenhower realized the USA, the victorious power, did not possess such a strategic weapon. He saw in the Autobahn not a road, but a doctrine. But to convince America to copy the idea of a recent enemy, he needed a resounding failure on its own territory. What exactly made the German Autobahn such an effective weapon? The details Eisenhower remembered for life were invisible to the civilian. Yes, of course, limited access, no intersections, divided flows. These are obvious solutions for speed. But the devil, as always, was in the details, dictated by the military. The multi-layered concrete foundation was designed for the weight of tank columns, not passenger cars. Gentle curves and wide shoulders served for maneuvering heavy equipment, and perfectly straight sections were designed as improvised runways for the Luftwaffe. It's like comparing a simple kitchen knife to a chef's complete toolkit. Eisenhower understood that the Autobahn was not an object, but an entire system. He decided to import into the USA not the road itself, but this approach. He brought this doctrine home, but the country needed a shock to realize its weakness. Eisenhower, as a military man, was not struck by the speed of the Autobahns. He was struck by something much more fundamental. Any logistician would appreciate fast delivery of goods and soldiers. But Eisenhower thought not as a logistician, but as a strategist. He saw that the Autobahns gave the Third Reich total control over its own territory. It was the nervous system of the state, allowing for the instantaneous projection of force to any point in the country. As head of the occupation forces, he saw reports of how the Gestapo used these roads for rapid transfer of punitive detachments. For Eisenhower, road construction became synonymous with strengthening national security. Without such a system, the USA remained a loose confederation of states, and not a unified military power. And very soon, long before the Second World War, he would have a chance to prove this through his own bitter experience. So Eisenhower saw the future in Germany. But why did his idea not find support for decades? Why did the country remain blind to its vulnerability? The answer lies in geography. America in the first half of the 20th century was protected by two oceans. Europe lived with a constant feeling of a draft from under the door. The threat was close and palpable. America, however, was in a warm room, unable to imagine the cold outside. In this context, spending billions on military roads seemed absurd. Eisenhower saw an invisible threat, the inability to quickly mobilize resources within the country. To prove his point, he needed not a theoretical dispute, but a practical catastrophe. A journey that was supposed to become a symbol of the American Army's might turned into a national disgrace and became the main argument for the future president. In 1919, the U.S. Army celebrated victory in the First World War. So why couldn't its elite convoy cross its own country faster than Caesar's legions? Among the participants of this expedition was young Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Eisenhower. Officially, the transcontinental convoy pursued two goals: to test the Army's mobility and to persuade Americans to build good roads. It all began as a parade, shining equipment, brave soldiers, starting right from the White House. But just a few miles later, the patriotic march turned into hell. Trucks sank in the mud up to their axles. Dozens of flimsy wooden bridges collapsed under their weight. The average speed of movement was only 5 miles per hour. The journey from Washington to San Francisco took 62 days. This was not just a failure. It was a public demonstration of the USA's complete strategic helplessness. This disgrace was forever etched in Eisenhower's memory. And when decades later he gained power, he faced a new battle, already in the quiet of offices. At the beginning of the 20th century, the USA had over 2 million miles of roads. Why then was the Army convoy practically immobilized? On paper, everything looked good. There was a good roads movement. States were building new routes. America was getting behind the wheel. The reality was dismal. The vast majority of these roads were simply dirt tracks that the first rain turned into impassable swamps. The convoy report was merciless. On a route of over 5,000 kilometers, only a few dozen miles of hard surface were encountered. 230 accidents were recorded in 62 days. 88 bridges were destroyed. In Nebraska, roads were described as gumbo sticky mud, in which trucks sank up to their frames. America was not a unified country. It was an archipelago of isolated cities connected only by the fragile thread of railways. It was this threat that Eisenhower later used as his main trump card in the biggest political battle of his life. Why did the newest military equipment designed for battlefields break down so quickly on American roads? Wasn't it designed for off-road conditions? Yes, trucks and tractors were sturdy. Engineers built in a huge margin of safety for combat. But equipment is designed for short-term peak loads, not for 62 days of continuous vibration, shaking, and fighting with mud. This worked like erosion. Not one strong impact, but millions of small continuous jolts day after day slowly ground down the steel. Frames cracked from constant shaking. Dust and mud clogged engines, turning them into useless metal. Infrastructure didn't just slow the Army, it physically destroyed it. Eisenhower learned a harsh lesson. An Army's strength is zero if you don't have roads capable of delivering that force quickly and without losses to the right point. This simple and ruthless conclusion formed the basis of the bill that forever changed the face of America. The humiliating experience of 1919 showed America what was wrong, and the inspiring example of Nazi Germany in 1945 showed Eisenhower how it should be. Why then, upon becoming president, couldn't he simply implement this idea? Eisenhower was a war hero. He was a president with immense authority. It seemed he could easily convince the nation of the necessity of a defense project. But the world had changed. Now the main threat was not a slow ground invasion, but an instantaneous nuclear strike. In this new reality, multi-billion-dollar expenditures on ordinary roads seemed pointless to many in Congress. Money was more needed for missiles, submarines, and bombers. To push his project through in these new conditions, Eisenhower had to resort to the greatest deception in the history of American politics. He sold the nation a road to economic prosperity, though in reality he was building a road for waging total nuclear war. How to convince a nation to spend an unthinkable sum on a project whose true purpose could not be directly named? Eisenhower was not selling roads. He was selling security, prosperity, and jobs. This was the truth, but not the whole truth. The key word was skillfully embedded in the official name, the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956. In his speeches, Eisenhower mentioned the economy 9 times and only once in passing uttered the full name. It was a masterclass in political marketing, selling military infrastructure under the brand of civilian progress. But behind the beautiful words lay numbers that shocked even his supporters. The initial estimate was $25 billion. This sum already seemed astronomical. But the final cost exceeded $129 billion. In modern prices, that's over $500 billion. This is twice as much as the entire Apollo program, which put a man on the moon. And here we unravel the financial paradox. Why didn't the money come from the Pentagon's budget? The answer was not economic, but political. The military budget is reviewed annually by Congress. Any senator could freeze the project. Eisenhower created a separate road fund, replenished by the gasoline tax. This took the mega project out of the control of politicians and guaranteed it stable funding for 35 years ahead. But what exactly made these roads so fabulously expensive? The answer lies in the 5 secret requirements that the Pentagon passed to the engineers. Why were many congressmen categorically against building modern roads in their own states? Their arguments sounded reasonable: too expensive for taxpayers, violation of states' rights, federal government overreach. But they were playing chess, while Eisenhower was playing a completely different game. The opposition, led by Senator Harry Byrd, argued about money and authority. The President and the Pentagon at this time were thinking in terms of deploying tank divisions and evacuating cities. The opponents of the project did not possess full information about the real stakes. Fighting against waste, they, without knowing it, were opposing a system that was supposed to save their constituents. In the end, the law was passed, and a secret 5-point instruction landed on the desks of engineers across the country, which determined the true face of America. So, the political battle was won. Money allocated, giant bulldozers, thousands of workers, concrete pouring. America saw the greatest civilian construction in history, but this was just a facade. Why were bridges built to precisely that height? Why was the concrete thickness excessive for trucks? Why were some sections in the desert perfectly straight for dozens of miles? This was not a coincidence or an engineering whim. The adoption of the law was like the closing of a circuit. Political energy was instantly converted into the kinetic energy of thousands of machines working according to a single secret blueprint. Every millimeter, every degree of curvature, every dollar over budget was dictated by military specifications. It's time to decipher the DNA of American highways. The first and most important secret code is hidden in plain sight. The standard minimum bridge height, 16 feet or 4.9 meters. Why exactly this figure? The obvious answer: for the largest trucks. This sounds like a simple and understandable civilian standard, but reality hit hard. Archival blueprints show that exactly this clearance was required for mobile Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile launchers. Engineers knew this standard as Minuteman clearance. Thousands of bridges from California to Maine were built to accommodate the dimensions of top-secret nuclear weapons. But the height of the bridge was only the first code. The second was embedded directly under the wheels. Why were American highways built with such excessive strength and width, making them incredibly expensive? Civilian logic is simple. Thick paving is needed for durability, and wide 12-foot lanes for safety. But the numbers shatter this picture. The thickness of reinforced concrete pavement, up to 30 centimeters, was designed not for 40-ton semi-trucks, but for the weight of 60-ton M48 Patton tanks. The width of the lanes ensured the safe movement of entire military convoys at high speed. It's as if you were building the skeleton of an ordinary person, but with the bone strength of a weightlifter. For everyday life, this is excessive, but it is designed for one single day of peak load. The next code is the most famous, but it is surrounded by so many myths that the truth turns out to be even more shocking. Everyone has heard the legend that every fifth mile of an American highway is perfectly straight to serve as a runway. This is false. But the truth is even more interesting. The 1 in 5 rule is an urban legend. However, the idea itself was absolutely real. Project documents indeed contained requirements for creating perfectly straight sections at least 1 mile long in strategically important areas. Their purpose: to serve as reserve runways for F-100 Super Sabre fighters in case of destruction of air bases during a first nuclear strike. The highway system transformed the entire territory of the USA into a gigantic, practically invulnerable aircraft carrier. But there was also a fifth, the darkest code. It concerned not the deployment of weapons, but the fate of millions of people in cities doomed to attack. Why do all interstate highways either lead directly into the centers of large cities or bypass them with beltways? The civilian answer is obvious. Roads connect places where people live and work. But the military logic was dual. Routes were designed for two opposite flows. The first, mass evacuation of the population from cities in case of a nuclear attack threat. The second, rapid deployment of the National Guard into cities to suppress unrest in chaotic conditions. This idea of rapid evacuation seemed the only chance for salvation. But the planners themselves knew it was a fiction. An internal report of the Federal Civil Defense Administration of 1958 directly concluded that mass auto-evacuation was unviable and would lead to catastrophic losses. This plan was a one-way ticket. So we have solved the paradox of the trap. But how exactly was it supposed to snap shut? A brochure from the Civil Defense Administration of 1957 stated, "Your family car is a lifeboat on an asphalt ocean." On paper, everything looked flawless: sirens, calm citizens getting into cars, an organized exodus from cities on wide highways. But analysts at the Rand Corporation modeled reality. One accident, one abandoned car on an exit. This is enough to trigger a chain reaction that, in minutes, turns the path to salvation into the world's largest parking lot under a nuclear target. The population density in these traffic jams would exceed that of central Manhattan. Highways did not save. They concentrated targets. If traffic jams were so predictable, why did the evacuation plan even exist? Did the military, who calculated the strength of bridges down to the millimeter, not see the obvious? The problem was not the roads, but fatal math. The flight time of an intercontinental ballistic missile from the USSR, about 30 minutes. The minimum time for alerts, packing, and the departure of a city of 1 million people, at least 48 hours. This is like trying to drain a pool with a thimble in 10 seconds. 95% of the population would not even have time to reach the highway. The cynical conclusion, the evacuation plan, was not for saving. Its purpose was to give people the illusion of action and prevent total chaos in cities during the last 30 minutes, while the government and military carried out their secret protocols. On maps, evacuation routes looked logical. But when they were attempted in practice during the annual Operation Alert exercises, the result was catastrophic. In 1955, simulation of a strike on Chicago showed that 2.5 million people would die in the first hours, many of them in gigantic traffic jams. The report was immediately classified. The government knew that the plan would not work. But it needed this fiction, this form of mass psychotherapy, to calm a nation living in constant fear. Highways in this context were not an engineering solution, but a psychological weapon. The system functioned not as a shield, but as a placebo. We have proven that the most advertised civilian function of highways, saving millions, was a deception. The history of the greatest infrastructure project looks like a story of cynical failure. But it was at this moment, when military logic collapsed, that the system began to live its own unforeseen life. The military tool escaped from the arsenal and began to reshape the world according to its own laws. The project, born out of fear of destruction, paradoxically became the main catalyst for creation. The military project, without intending to, became the engine of the American dream. How did a project designed for the passage of tank columns give birth to McDonald's? At first glance, everything is simple. Trucks drive faster, goods become cheaper, trade grows. But this only explains a small part of the effect. The system did not just accelerate the old economy, it created a completely new one. Three pillars of this new America: suburbanization, which allowed millions to live far from work; national networks of motels and restaurants that grew along the asphalt rivers; and a revolution in logistics, which created giant Walmart warehouses and FedEx hubs. The project, aimed at total centralization of control in case of war, led to an unprecedented decentralization of population and economy in peacetime. But this new prosperity was distributed extremely unevenly. Who actually profited from the most expensive project in history? The obvious winners: Detroit automakers, oil giants, and construction corporations. But the real revolution happened in the shadows. Californian farmers were able for the first time to feed fresh lettuce to New York. The number of visitors to national parks increased almost fourfold, from 60 to 200 million people per year. And suburban shopping centers appeared, which slowly killed the main streets of small towns. Highways became the operating system of American consumer society. But this dream had a price, and it was paid by those whose homes were in the path of progress. How could one and the same road simultaneously create and destroy? For the white middle class, it became the path to the dream: a suburban home, a lawn, 2 cars. This was white flight from crowded cities. But maps of highway routes through Detroit, Chicago, and Baltimore tell a different story. The routes were often purposefully laid through prosperous minority neighborhoods. This was called slum clearance. Over 475,000 families were forcibly displaced. In Miami, I-95 was laid directly through the heart of Overtown, the Harlem of the South, tearing apart the community with a concrete scar. For some, the road became a symbol of mobility; for others, a wall. By the beginning of the 60s, the military origin of the system had faded from memory. Highways became commonplace, just asphalt under the wheels. Until October 1962. For 13 days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear apocalypse. And at that moment, the American command activated secret protocols. Everyone remembered the forgotten word in the official name: the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. The sleeping giant awoke. Across the country, an invisible military machine came into motion, preparing to use civilian infrastructure as its main weapon. On October 16, 1962, while President Kennedy looked at aerial photographs of Cuba, American highways received a series of secret orders. How could an invasion army be moved to the coast of Florida without causing nationwide panic? News showed ships and planes. This was the story everyone knows. But the reality on the ground was striking. On I-95 and I-75, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and thousands of units of equipment moved in a continuous stream. This was the largest mobilization of the era. Ordinary family sedans drove in the neighboring lane with military trucks, hiding tactical nuclear weapons under tarpaulins. The system worked perfectly, quickly, efficiently, and secretly. But the movement of troops was only the visible part of the activation. How can a military column move at maximum speed on a busy civilian highway? What made thousands of drivers yield the road? This was not accidental. There was a secret mechanism for switching the system into military mode. Road police provided a green corridor. But this was just a screen. In reality, key bridges and interchanges were taken under the guard of military police. Plans for the complete closure of sections for civilians were activated, and strategic straight sections were prepared for receiving military transport aviation. For 13 days, highways ceased to be public domain. They became part of a military machine, controlled from the Pentagon. The order to attack did not come. But the silence of the missiles did not mean that nothing had changed. Why is this large-scale military movement practically absent from accounts of the Cuban Missile Crisis? The focus of attention was on ships at sea and Kennedy's speeches. But the real reason is different. Most documents concerning this mobilization remained secret for decades. The system was designed as a quiet weapon, allowing for mass operations without causing panic among its own population. The Cuban Missile Crisis proved the genius of this design. A driver who complained about traffic due to the military did not realize that he had witnessed preparations for nuclear war. This was the highest achievement of the project. The world was saved, and the gigantic military machine once again disguised itself as ordinary roads. But the legacy of this fear remained imprinted in the asphalt. In a moment of existential threat, the highway system performed its defense function flawlessly. On October 28th, the war was called off, and the world exhaled. But what does this test mean for us living decades later? After the crisis, highways could never again be just roads. Their military DNA was proven in practice. They became silent monuments to humanity's greatest fear, fossils of a fierce era. We inherited infrastructure born of fear, which paradoxically ensured economic prosperity. It's time to put all the pieces of the puzzle together and understand what truly lies beneath the asphalt we drive on every day. This entire gigantic system was born from two images in the mind of one person. The first, the smooth concrete of the German Autobahn, a symbol of total control and military power. The second, the sticky mud of Nebraska, in which his own convoy sank, a symbol of national humiliation and helplessness. On one side was the vision of how it should be. On the other, the bitter realization of how everything actually was. A journey of 3,250 miles, covered at an average speed of only 5 miles per hour. This contrast between German order and American chaos became Eisenhower's personal crusade. The highway system was not an economic plan. It was a response to a deep feeling of military humiliation. But to bring this purely military idea to life, he needed the greatest political bluff in history. The idea required money and political will, and Eisenhower implemented it using a three-part mechanism. The first part, the bluff. The project was sold to the nation as a civilian initiative for economic prosperity. The second part, the secret code. True military requirements were secretly woven into engineering standards, where the 16-foot bridge height was dictated not by trucks, but by the dimensions of mobile Atlas intercontinental ballistic missile launchers. And the third part, the paradox. The loudest civilian goal, mass evacuation, turned out to be a fiction, masking the true purpose of the system. It was a multi-layered operation, where each level masked the next, but its real impact turned out to be completely different from what the generals planned. So, what did we get in the end? On the one hand, an unintended engine of the American dream. Every dollar invested in the system brought the economy more than $6 in return. Highways gave birth to suburbia, modern logistics, and consumer society. On the other hand, the Cuban Missile Crisis showed their true face, the face of a doomsday weapon. This is a legacy of prosperity that grew on a foundation of fear. In his farewell address of 1961, Eisenhower warned of the danger of the military-industrial complex. He did not say that he had just built its main artery. American highways are the greatest artifact of the Cold War, the physical embodiment of its main paradox. To preserve peace, one had to constantly prepare for total war. Now that you know the whole story, from Eisenhower's conception to the Cuban Missile Crisis, from the economic miracle to the social scars, it's time for your conclusion. What are American highways to you? On the one hand, they are a brilliant defense project that provided security and prosperity through strength and strategic calculation. On the other, they are a frightening symbol of militarism, forever etched into civilian life, a monument to fear and deception. We ask you to make a choice and write in the comments just one word that reflects your final opinion, project, or symbol. No long explanations, just your ultimate verdict. Let's see who outnumbers whom, because beneath the asphalt we drive on every day lies not just a road but an entire history.